Okay, so this is going to be our 6th video talking about Baldur's Gate 3 from things we learned while we were playing with Larian and Ghent a week ago. And in this video, I want to talk a bit about the size of Baldur's Gate 3 and replayability of this game. I've talked a little bit about why I think Baldur's Gate 3 is going to win Game of the Year, and I think this is probably one of the more compelling reasons. So let's get into that. So first, let's just take a look at something we know to be fact. There are 174 hours of cutscenes in Baldur's Gate 3. What does that mean? Obviously, that does not mean that you will see 174 hours of cutscenes, or you should be worried that you're watching the longest movie in the history of gaming. What this means is that the width or breadth of Baldur's Gate 3 is likely larger than anything we've ever seen before in gaming. This means the absolute variety of things that can happen in the game based on your decisions, your class, your subclass, your race, your companions, how your companions feel about you in the moment versus how they felt about you 10 hours ago from the decisions that you made. All these things are going to impact what you see in your playthrough, and the number that we're really missing here is the average amount of cutscene you will see in a single playthrough. If we had that number, we would have a much better idea of gameplay hours, but you would also have a much better idea of possible variations. Now, I expect a lot of people to have similar playthroughs with subtle differences. That's probably going to be the case for a lot of people, particularly people who are going for like a good playthrough. They will probably have very similar good playthroughs, but not everything's going to be the same, right? Because their companions are going to be different. Their class is going to be different. Their race is going to be different. These are going to change some of the encounters they have and how they're handled. In my discussions with Larian, like in terms of the game's length at the event, I was told between 60 to 80 hours of gameplay for a single playthrough. I think we can all expect more than that. I think this is a modest number from what I've seen so far. We know that early access is about a quarter of the game. Early access, my first playthrough took me about 30 hours, and I was being thorough, and I'm still sure I missed stuff on my first playthrough. So I think if that's a quarter, you're probably looking at 100, 120 hours-ish on a single playthrough if you're a very thorough person who just doesn't rush the game. And obviously, probably if you're playing Tactician, it might be a little bit slower. You know, depending on how good you are at combat, these things can fluctuate a bit. But if we're just, factoring in what we've been told so far, I think you're looking at somewhere around 100 to 120 hours of gameplay for a single playthrough, which is about roughly what DOS 1 and DOS 2 were in a playthrough as well. So that sort of makes sense to me in terms of the length of the game. And you might be thinking, well, with 174 hours of cutscenes, it's got to be longer than that. There's no way a playthrough plays that. But again, I think this 174 hours of cutscenes just means that unlike DOS 1 and DOS 2, even though there were a myriad of ways you could handle different scenarios, I think that it's more about the path that you take. There are a lot more paths. Maybe in DOS 1 and DOS 2, there were 5 paths you could take to get to the end. Maybe there are 10 paths or 15 paths or 20 paths or, and I'm just talking about core paths here, not like the little details that change, which we know this will be different from playthrough to playthrough. But I'm just talking in terms of directions you can go, ways you can get to the end of the game. I think the difference between those games and this game is really that there's going to be more ways and more freedom to play through Baldur's Gate 3 than in DOS 1 and DOS 2. And something that was really interesting is I spent some time talking to Crystal, who's one of the lead writers on the project. And she's working predominantly on the ending of the game. And she's been working on that for 6 months, right? Just the ending of the game, which is incredible. And I asked her, how many variations of the ending are there? And she told me that there were 17,000 variations of the ending. Now, that was the exact number she gave me, 17,000. Now, we know that that's not going to be like the main story. There isn't 17,000 main story endings, but that's obviously factoring in all the permeations and variables that a player can have. So there are essentially probably something like 17,000 different possible endings based on the decisions that you make. So that means 17,000 people could theoretically play and see something different on the ending screen. Now, that is a completely staggering number. And obviously, some of these, again, are just subtle, minor differences, but I have never heard of another RPG ever mentioning that number or would ever even come close to that number in the number that they said. So I asked her, I said, okay, well, those are probably small differences. What about main differences in the ending, like main ending differences? She didn't have a number for me. She didn't know the answer. And I believe her when she says that, which means probably that the number is too big to think with, with just a small amount of time to think about it, right? Like she'd have to sit there and actually think about it. She couldn't just give me an off-the-cuff answer, which means it's probably a big number. I'm not saying it's anywhere near 17,000. I don't think it's even close to that. but it's not like 5. You know what I mean? So the main ending is probably going to have a lot of variation as well, which means that this game has a lot of replayability because people are going to want to see things from different perspectives. If you take a look at some of the all-time great RPGs like Knights of the Old Republic, Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, Fallout 1 and 2, old BioWare games like Dragon Age Origins, Mass Effect, these type of games where there are a lot of important decisions, things aren't always easy to decide, and there are different endings depending on what you do throughout the course of the game. I think it's safe to say that very few people played these games once. Almost everyone who's played these games has played them through multiple times to see things from different perspectives, to do a good playthrough, to do a bad playthrough, to do somewhere in the middle playthrough. I think most people have minimally played these games twice, probably likely 3 times, and some people even more than that. So when you talk about Baldur's Gate 3 having all these 174 hours of cutscenes, 17,000 variations of endings, I don't know how many actual variations of the main ending, you're talking about lots of playthroughs here where you're seeing stuff you didn't see in previous playthroughs. I would wager one of my all-time favorite games, if not my favorite game of all time, Knights of the Old Republic, probably had like a good solid 3 playthroughs in it before you started to overlap so much it wasn't necessarily worth playing, a 4th time for new content. I have played that game way more than that amount of times just because I love that game. But if you're just talking about seeing new content, I don't think you're going to get much after a 3rd playthrough. However, in Baldur's Gate 3, I think that's different. I think you're going to continue to see things in 5, 6, 7, 8 playthroughs that you never saw before, and in a quantity that's enough that it will propel you to keep playing more playthroughs. And even if the average person only plays 2 or 3 playthroughs, I think it's going to be a higher average than any other RPG of this type that's seen before. So obviously, part of this is the classes, subclasses, races, these things not only impact your dialogue options in terms of what you see on the screen, which further impacts your replayability, but also from a gameplay perspective, which is not something we've talked about really in this video yet, is these things also impact your gameplay. How do you approach objectives? How do you solve problems? How do you play in combat? What abilities, what tactics do you use in combat because of your class, your subclass? Did you multi-class? How did you multi-class your character? So all that adds a new experience to the playthrough that keeps it fresh, I think, while you're exploring and receiving new cutscenes and seeing things you didn't see before. It's going to keep the combat somewhat fresh for you compared to one of these other games that I mentioned, these all-time greats, where those things aren't necessarily that different. Obviously, those games have different classes as well that help to keep things fresh. But I think in terms of the amount of customization for your characters, the amount of classes you could play, the amount of subclasses, the different degrees of multi-classing you could do, I don't think we've seen an RPG with quite this extent, unless you count something like Pathfinder, which obviously is kind of the king of that. But in the sense, that game doesn't have, in my opinion, quite the amount of permeations that Baldur's Gate 3 does. So you're sacrificing some of that character customization in Baldur's Gate 3, but you're gaining a lot more in terms of outcomes and decisions and obviously, cutscenes that you're going to see in its place. And sort of wrapped inside this discussion is respecing, right? Whether this actually harms the replayability of the game or improves it. And I know a lot of people out there saying, well, if you can respec, then why go through the game as another class or anything different when you can just respec and play that and you don't have to create a new character? And I'm kind of in the opposite camp. I actually think respecing in this game will actually improve replayability, and I'll elaborate here on why that is. I think it's fair to say that a fair amount of new players are going to be playing Baldur's Gate 3. What I mean by new players is I mean players that didn't play Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, players that are not overly familiar with D&D and video games, because to be honest, there are not a ton of them outside of Pathfinder recently, which is based off D&D. There are not a ton of D&D recent video games. There just aren't. So I think it's fair to expect a lot of RPG enthusiasts to be playing this game that are not familiar with D&D. And when they go to select their class and their subclass, they're going to try and find something that they want to play that's close to what they might like to play in other RPGs. So they're going to pick their class and subclass based on this fact. And they may get it wrong some of the time. I expect some of them to get it wrong. I expect some of them to think they knew how a class or subclass played, but then once they played it, they decided it's not really for them. And this might take a while. It might take a little bit of game time for them to really realize this. And they might want to make a subtle change like, maybe I got the right class, but maybe I want to change my subclass. and play a different subclass that looks a little bit cooler. Or maybe they are playing like a wizard, but they go, you know what, like sorcerer actually seems more my jam than wizard. So I want to change to sorcerer and try out sorcerer, even though I like wizard, but sorcerer might be closer to what I'm playing. I think this is a probability for a lot of players. And the crux of the situation is, if those players had to restart the game, let's say they played 10 hours in, 15 hours in, before they realized it's not really the class for me. I know I have about 100 hours or something to go, a lot of hours. It's easier for me to just start over now than it is to keep playing the whole game as a class that I don't really like. So they go and they change their class, or maybe they just change their subclass and they start over. Maybe some of those players get it wrong again, or maybe they've played far enough into the game that when they start over, they're just not as enthusiastic about starting the game over again, and they put the game down and don't play as much. I am guilty of playing 10 to 12 hours into a game, realizing that I'd be better off with a different build that's maybe similar but slightly different, starting over, doing this time and time again, and then eventually getting to the point where I sort of burn out before I've even made it through one act. This has happened to me countless times with games, particularly before I got into the gaming industry, since it's more, I'm more driven by content now than I was then. But this has happened to me numerous times, and I know from talking to other players this happens to them as well. So I think what respecking can do for a player is prevent that feeling and allowing them to make a subtle change to their build, then allows them to enjoy their playthrough without having to go back to the beginning and starting over one, maybe two times. I think there's a tendency for people to think when they hear respecking, well, if there's respecking, then why would anyone ever play another class? And it's like, most players are not going to play the game as a fighter starting out and then jump to a wizard and go, oh, I really wanted to play a wizard, I'm going to play that. And then, a quarter of the way through the game, go like, now I'm going to play a rogue. Like, first of all, itemization would probably make that very, unfulfilling to do. But I think that's probably not the normal player, right? The normal player may decide, hey, I'm playing a fighter, I really want to play a wizard, I'm going to change to wizard. But that it's probably will stop there. They'll play as a wizard the rest of the way. Or maybe they'll play as a wizard and realize they picked the wrong school of wizard and they want to change the school of wizard one other time. But I don't think you're going to see people just leapfrogging around from class to class, playing every single class in a single playthrough, and then going, you know what, I don't want to play a new playthrough because I've seen every class. I just don't think that's the case. And another thing to remember, too, is keep in mind that your race is fixed, right? Like once you change or select your race, you're not going to be able to change that. So, and that has implications dialogue-wise and story-wise, but it also has, visual appearance. People may like the look of their race or not like it, and they'd have to start over in that case. And I think players, that will add something in subsequent playthroughs. Even if you played the same class, if you played a different race, you're going to be seeing different content. So there is something to be said for that as well. And lastly, something I mentioned earlier in the video, but I haven't discussed at length here, and something we talked a bit about in the last video, is companions, right? These characters all have different storylines, and whether you selected an origin character or decided to bring X characters along or change the characters that you're bringing along, you're going to see and have reactions to things that are different depending on which characters you have. And I'm 99% sure that a lot of those interactions with those characters are going to depend on whether they approve of you or not, and how much they approve of you. So obviously, if you have their approval, they're probably going to react to you differently than if they hate your guts. I mean, that's just, how good writing works. So you could have different outcomes with the same characters as somebody else based on the decisions that you made along the way. So I don't think a lot of people are taking that into account into how much that's going to impact future playthroughs as well. I mean, not only do you have the things I mentioned before, but also all these companions you can bring or not bring with you and their dynamics between them and how they react to you and the stories that are being told. All those things influence replayability because maybe you have like 5 companions you really like, but you can only bring 3 with you. So that means you need another playthrough just to see the other 2. And then maybe after you do that, you want to see some of the other ones. So there's a lot of things to factor into replayability, but I think it's probably one of the best aspects of Baldur's Gate 3, and it's probably one of the most compelling arguments for Game of the Year. I mean, how many games have this much variety, this many variables? I don't think, from a wiki perspective, we're obviously working on the wiki for the game. I don't know how long it's going to take us to get all this information in there in terms of possible cutscenes, possible outcomes. I mean, we're really going to be relying on the Baldur's Gate 3 community to help fill that out because there's just so much. I mean, if I sat here and played through the game every day for a year, I don't think I would have every outcome that you could possibly have in this game. And players are going to want the information a lot sooner than that. So we're obviously going to be relying on a lot of people to help fill that in. But that's incredible, right? I mean, DOS 2 had a lot of variety and things that you can do, and it took a while to get these things into the wiki. Pathfinder as well, but not to the extent that Baldur's Gate 3 has, and I simply cannot think of a game that even comes close. So that kind of wraps up my video on replayability, the length of this game. Another reason I think it's going to be Game of the Year. It's not the only reason, but this is a big one. I mean, how much content can you get out of this game that's not just repeat content? And is it good enough for you to want to do it? I think the answer to that is it's a lot, and yes, it's good enough. And I want to hear from you guys. Are you guys planning on playing the game multiple times? Am I crazy here? Are there people out there that are only going to play Baldur's Gate 3 once? I just don't think that's the case. And another thing that I didn't even mention here that, you could factor into this as well is multiplayer. You could play this by yourself, go through the whole story, and then co-op it with your friends. And another part we didn't mention also, modding. If that's a thing for this game, how much life is this game going to get? Let me know what you guys think.